I find that campus is deserted if it's the last 2 weeks of class, if it's midterms, and
Yeah.
that's when I'm gonna, if I am gonna go in, I'm definitely getting a parking spot.
I take it you got a parking spot today.
It's like the week before midterms and like I wanted a parking spot, but otherwise, like if it's not like super important weeks, then it's like usually it's like everyone's like rushing into school, they can get that one spot.
Yeah, I know. Like I got parked in Tim's, and usually, I'll show up at 8:30 in the morning, and it's fairly full.
The stadium parking is a nightmare. If you want a parking spot anywhere remotely close to the ground, get up and be here at 7.
Yeah, I would never. Like I used to park in Windsor, and they like oversell it.
It makes me so angry because they oversell it and then they're like, hey guys, fight for it. Even though you got a parking pass, you're not guaranteed a spot.
Yeah, which is like,
That's the whole point of a parking pass, that you're guaranteed a spot.
no, you're guaranteed not to get a ticket if you park there,
Yeah,
right?
yes.
And it's cheaper than paying the daily
Yeah.
if you get your lot. I had to switch to
It's the other case. It is, they only sell from,
oh yeah,
and but like the
Stadium in Windsor they oversell. I was late to class one day because I was like, okay, I have a parking pass, but there's no stalls in here, and I had to drive around. Yeah, and I finally got one, and then I moved, and I paid a lot more to park at Harris, which is like super far away. But I was like, at least I know there's a spot there because they don't oversell that. Plus, it's super far away, so nobody wants to actually park there. So I was like, I'll get my steps in,
Yeah.
and I will, you know, have a parking spot. Plus, it was nice because in the winter they keep it at like 22 degrees down there. So I would like come from outside and I'm freezing cold and I have to get like undressed to actually get in my car. My car was always toasty warm, which since my car is older, definitely it appreciates the defrost.
Uncomfortable.
Yeah. Oh. Hey, Rich. How's it going? Good. Oh, I feel like I've been hit by a math truck. You know, excited to be here? Well, this is the most exciting of all. We're talking about writing up social research. By the way, I will say this is it. I have no more content. I've scraped the bottom of the barrel for every last bit of intro to methods content. Okay, because you asked, Rage, I will find more content. I will find something else. There's just nothing. This is the entire text, but we could go back to like structured observation from quantitative methods if you want, but I don't want it because it's dumb. So I'm like basically it'll probably be our last lecture, unless for some reason this takes much longer than I thought. Which and everything else I will be hanging around Wednesday and Monday of next week, just for I'll go back to my office if you have questions about labs or anything. You finally want to go over your midterm, you know, I will be in my office, and I will make that announcement to everyone, you know, so that no one who isn't here today just shows up. What's that? Oh, so, because I'm sure all the people who never show up are just dying to come in the last week. But this is probably it for our content. But I don't want them to come and then be wondering what's happening. I don't want them to be confused. So I will put out an official announcement. But yeah, that's true. We will be taking attendance. 45. Yeah. It's actually 100%. I've zeroed out everything else we've done in the course. And it's like, if you come, however, you have to find me. I'll be hiding somewhere on campus. I will leave a series of intricate clues. One of them is in Da Vinci's Last Supper. Yeah. 5 words. It's somewhere in chapter 15 of the textbook. Alrighty. Okay. So, yeah, basically, this is it. I mean, this is all of the content for the course. Oh, my voice is giving out a little bit. Okay. So, we're just going to I don't know what it is. These days where I lecture for 3 hours towards the end of the term. I got sick last week. All I need now is to actually lose my voice and have to try and make it through the end of the semester with no voice. So we're going to talk about kind of writing up research really quickly, go through it. And however soon we finish it, we are done the content for the course. So there is that. All right. Okay. Excuse me. So why do writing up is important. It's telling the story of your research. And obviously, if you're going into academia, when you're wanting to do a master's, a PhD, or if you are, a professor, it's important to disseminate your research, right? Otherwise, why are you doing research? Just to hold on to it for your precious self. And of course, right, it's important for your career. You need publications to prove, to get tenure, to get into PhD programs, and all of that stuff, get funding, all that jazz. It really, really helps. Okay. Now, your aim in writing is to convince your community that your research is significant, relevant, and interesting, right? That you found something that is worth talking about. And you have to persuade your reader, typically, that your findings are valid, your work meets standards of research accepted among social scientists. Okay, so slightly different process for quantitative research than qualitative research. We'll talk about each of them. But your kind of basic building blocks of your typical, say, research paper in quantitative research looks like this, right? So you have your abstract, kind of quick summary of what your thing is about. Some people swear that you can basically read the abstract of the paper and the conclusion, and you can get everything that was in the paper. Not highly recommended, but it's a technique. Intro, your theory, right? So how you're, in quantitative methods, this means something slightly different. Whatever data you're using, how it was measured, methods and models. And, one of the things you'll notice in quantitative research, often you don't actually get to the results of your research until relatively late in the paper. And often, the results set a relatively short portion. And then conclusion, telling people what the research was all about. And then obviously your bibliography. Okay, so introduction. Now this is probably a little bit more structured than I would say, but then I'm not typically I don't write quantitative research papers. But your first 4 sentences, or very, very quickly, should identify the significance of the paper, and your introduction outlines the contribution that your article will make. Like, you should very quickly. I'm really talking too fast. I'm sorry. I found the good cough medicine with pseudoephedrine in it. Neocitrin still has pseudoephedrine apparently, and so it makes my head feel a little swimmy. Yeah, I don't know why, but I like Dayquil doesn't have it anymore. But neocitrin, maybe I've just had it for a really long time, so it's expired pseudoephedrine. I'm like, woo! The closest thing I get to being on drugs is taking cough medicine. Okay, so what is it? Right, you should be answering the so what. Like, who cares about your research? Your introduction should make a pretty good case as to why people care. Why is it relevant? Why is it interesting? All of that stuff. And kind of very quickly situate the article within existing literature, right? So cite a few things that it's related to and say how it fits into the overall literature. Okay, theory. You outline your theoretical issues, what kind of theories is it connected to, what's relevant to your study, and discuss theories from which the hypothesis has been derived, right? So you're gonna probably come up in a quantitative paper with like that's it, just says hi. H1, a couple of hypotheses to test, but you need a kind of theoretical lens from which to kind of derive your hypotheses. What's the theoretical lens, right? What kind of body of theory are you drawing from to create your hypotheses, right? To interpret your data. Okay, the data part, quantitative writing isn't always the most fun because you start with explaining your data, right? So how did you get it? Sampling procedures, sample sizes, how the data was recorded, techniques typically discussed, right? So this is where, you would be like, we conducted a survey of 500 people, using this platform. This was the margin of error. And this is our confidence interval, right? So you're just going to outline all the really boring technical stuff in the data section, right? You collected this many responses, right? You had, this many non-responsive. All that stuff goes into your data. The measurement, right? This is your operationalization. You're going to explain how main concepts are measured, right? You measured loneliness using the UCLA Loneliness Index or some such thing, right? So this is your operationalization. Remember space? Right? Operationalization, how your concepts are measured, and all of that stuff, right? So pretty dry. And if you ever read lots of quantitative papers, the first few sections are quite dry, right? Because they're just describing process. Okay, so your methods and models, you're going to describe proposed relationship between your key variables and the data analysis method that you use, right? So here, if you did like, multilinear regressions or, bivariate regressions, whatever you did, crosstabs, correlation analysis using Pearson's R, whatever it happens to be, right, that you used, you know, here, you just describe, how you did the analysis, right? How did you figure out the relationship between the variables, what the data analysis was, and then, you finally get to the results. Sometimes this is also my voice. Sometimes this is also called the discussion. So you'll see this used variably in quantitative papers, either results or discussion, or basically discuss, whether your hypothesis is supported. You discuss the findings in detail, right? So you're like, okay, H1 was not supported, but H2 was supported. And what does this mean, right? And that's basically it. And then the conclusions. Wow, we did that really quickly. Conclusions. Again, sometimes when people talk about quantitative papers, they talk about the conclusions really like the results and the conclusions being the only things you have to read. I don't think that's true. But a lot of people will skip through to the conclusions and results because the issues discussed in the introduction and theory section are addressed, right? You basically say, okay, what was found, how does it relate to theories, and then you kind of go to the implications that come from the hypothesis being accepted or rejected, right? So a lot of times, especially recently in the quantitative papers I've read, it's like, okay, we found support for hypothesis 1 and 2, but we don't know why. So what we need to do is some qualitative research, to kind of find out the why of this, right? So that could be a really typical kind of conclusion, or more research needed on this subject, right? It fits into this body, so it backs up this kind of theoretical assumption and all of that jazz. Okay. Too fast. Definitely going too fast. Okay, that's okay. So, okay. So, with quantitative research, kind of things you need to think about when you're writing quantitative research. How are you going to capture the reader's attention when you're in the early article? There are hundreds of these things, thousands, tens of thousands of quantitative articles published every single year, right? And so, I don't think I have my microphone on. That would probably help. Oh, that's so much better. I don't have to talk so loud. I'll whisper. No. Okay, that actually sounds better. I'm still talking at the same volume, but that's okay. Okay. How are you gonna capture? Like, I had one supervisor who always wanted like a punchy sentence. Something punchy at the top, like a provocative phrase to capture people's attention. I didn't like that. I thought it was a little bit juvenile in terms of writing. But you do whatever your supervisors tell you to do. You have to try and capture people's attention, right? Why would they want to read past a couple lines of the abstract? Why does your research matter, right? So again, so what? Who cares? Why is this important? Is kind of key. What's the spell out the rationale? Why are you doing the research and why does it matter, right? So the so what again, why does anything matter? Research question and hypotheses have to be stated clearly, right? So that people know what you're trying to prove, what you're trying to kind of figure out, what you're trying to learn. And then, data collection, measurement, sampling, and other aspects of the research design are way more elaborated. This is something, when you go to write qualitative, qualitative doesn't have, like if I go back to this kind of chart, all of this, is often, hang on, I will use a different color, purple. You'll often not see any of this stuff with qualitative research, right? Because they're kind of structured much differently in terms of how you write them up. But in order for people to make assessments of whether you did the processes correctly, especially peer reviewers, the quantitative stuff requires you to have all of these extra parts. Okay, and to put way more stress on them, which is why I say often this is something like, probably 2/3 of the research paper will end up being just this stuff, right? So they can feel very boring to read through because it's like, we conducted a poll between September 14th and September 24th of 2024, where we sampled, we sent out 1,500 and got 400, that kind of stuff. Okay. All right. Findings should be discussed in the context of the research question, hypotheses, right? So the findings, you need to relate them. How do they relate? I've heard people say that sometimes this is really awkward to do because, for example, I knew one person and they were doing this kind of quantitative research, and basically they had proposed 3 hypotheses and all 3 of them ended up being disproved. So it was like I was wrong about everything. And I think part of it was like, I need to rethink my life. But no, that wasn't quite it. But they were like, I was wrong about everything. My research question clearly isn't properly formulated. Really we're asking the wrong questions, and that's the interesting part, right? We're asking the wrong question because the data is pointing us in a different direction. So that is, how does it relate to the research question? Well, clearly our research question, is improperly formulated because we're not talking. I always remember people writing, like 2-sentence theses. That was always funny because people would write things like, trying to find, a link between these 2 things. There wasn't one. And that's like the summary of their whole 7 years of a PhD, which I always think would be kind of tragic to realize that you did 7 years of a PhD to find absolutely nothing, but it does happen. Okay, and your conclusion section should discuss the implications of the findings for the hypotheses and the theoretical framework adopted, right? So what are the implications? Does it prove the theory? Does the theory need to be rethought? Does it suggest new avenues? Does it suggest, there's some new phenomenon out there that we're not accounting for? All of these things. Okay. And this is like the most typical, like you could go to any quantitative journal, right? Go to the Journal of Criminology, or any other, sociology of religion, any of the quantitative work usually follows the same kind of approach. It's very, very cookie cutter. Okay. Sometimes people add a discussion section between results and conclusions. Sometimes people just work the discussions to the results. Just to say like, oh, here are some interesting thoughts, and interpretations we had from working with this data. Okay. Oh, qualitative research. So, qualitative research is a little bit different. So, you always start with an abstract, right? Again, this is like the short version of your paper. Tells people, kind of an outline and, hooks them to see if they're wanting to read it. An intro. The literature review, which is a little bit different because qualitative research will tend to be a little bit more, especially theory bound, but more like social theory rather than like create a theory to explain the phenomenon, and situate your research into existing literature to kind of tell people the context for it. Design and methods, it's going to depend. Sometimes you do this, it depends on what you're doing, and sometimes like this section can be really, really, really short, right? Sometimes just like I've had design and method sections, especially when I'm doing content analysis, be like a couple of sentences, right? Maybe a short paragraph at the most, but just explaining how you did your research. Results, again, I don't always know that you put results into qualitative. Sometimes like a results section, sometimes But often, it's more kind of discussion, kind of describing what you found, and then conclusions and bibliography, like everything else. Okay, so your introduction, basically the same thing, right? Outlines what your study is about, what contribution the article is going to make, right? Why it's important. It answers the so what question, and hopefully, situates it a little bit in the existing literature, though that will happen more in the lit review. So this, I will say, is always my least favorite part of qualitative writing, is the literature review, where you basically go and you summarize very quickly what other people have said about this particular topic, usually, with the goal of identifying a gap, right? A gap in the literature, something that the literature is not currently discussing, which your article is going to fit into nicely and essentially, solve that problem by filling in this gap in the literature, right? So this can be one of the harder things to do, because sometimes trying to think of how especially when you're a junior scholar, how your research sort of fills in some kind of big gap in literature, it can feel like you're making like false claims, but you just have to figure out like, okay, this topic needed to be explored further, hasn't been looked at in a while. There are new things that we can learn about it. I looked at it in a new context, which tells us something different, right? You're looking in the literature review for that space or that gap where there's something not being explained by the literature. So you summarize what's out there and you're like, okay, here's the gap that my research fits into. Okay. So essentially, right, when you're doing writing up your qualitative research, it's the same basic process. You're going to say what you did, right? So how did you get the data that you're looking at? And again, this could look, because there's a ton of variability in qualitative research, this can look really, really kind of interesting and confusing. So, you could be like, okay, I got, trying to think. Let's say you're doing content analysis. So you looked at, diaries from, 75 people, and you did interviews with, a further 35, right? Whatever it happens to be, whatever your method was, you just kind of outline it in this particular section, right? And you could do mixed methods, you have all sorts of things, right? We outline essentially how you approach the topic, right? So all sorts of things like, okay, who was studied and why, and typically, if you're doing case studies, you give some kind of justification, for why you did this particular case, right? Why you interviewed these people, why you selected this content for analysis, all of this kind of stuff. If you're doing interviews or focus groups, how respondents were recruited, how you actually, reach people, all of that stuff, right? So how did you get a number of participants, the interviews and the context of how many you actually talk to, type of research done, was it ethnography, unstructured interviews, focus groups, or whatever? And the analytical approach, right? Did you do thematic analysis or, honed it using this principle, right? You did grounded theory, right? You did grounded theory approach, whatever it happens to be here. Now, I will say, I've done, lots of qualitative research papers, like journal articles. I've never actually really had to spell out like my analytical approach, in terms of like how I did this so explicitly. I think depending on the journal, some journals are a little bit looser with this kind of stuff than others are. So you won't have to do this in absolutely every case, but stuff like, what you did, how many participants there were, if you did interviews, how much content you looked at, what the time period was, all of this stuff. would matter tremendously. Okay. So, findings. What was it, the meaning of it? I always have a little bit of trouble with this, like as a heading, findings and discussion. Because the way I've always done it is it's much more narrative. Things are kind of integrated. You're describing the cases, you're describing what you found, right? And you kind of go through it, and it's a little bit more organic. This makes it seem like you do like one section that's like findings, right? The meaning and significance of results obtained, and then the discussion, where you go into the research question, the theory, you actually put quotes from your participants and all of that stuff in. It rarely, qualitative rarely writes up like this. If you read qualitative research, it often has a whole lot more flow than this. This makes it seem very mechanical, and I've never actually done it in this kind of way. These two things are kind of together, right? You say what you found, and then you support it with evidence from, your research. And then your conclusions. The implications of your findings for the existing literature, the discipline or public policy, and public policy are presented, right? Why does it matter? What does it tell us? The so what? Almost inevitably, I'll tell you my trick of the trade. What always happens to me is I write a terrible introduction because I'm terrible at writing introductions. And then because sometimes I process while I write. So I write up a research paper and I didn't quite know what I wanted to say in the introduction. And then I write everything up and then I go and I write the conclusion. And then I finally figured out what I wanted to say in the conclusion. So then I copy and paste the conclusion and I make it my introduction. I delete the introduction I wrote, and then I write a new conclusion that basically like briefly restates. And I found this is like the best method for writing introductions is to actually just copy and paste my conclusion, make that my introduction, tweak it up, and then clean up, any inconsistencies in my thinking that comes from the fact that I hadn't quite processed everything until I got the paper. But, I'm a funny writer. Not everyone does that. I've never been the writer. Some of my friends and my boss are like this. Are like, this is the plan. My boss is German. So she's like, this is the plan for the paper, and it will follow exactly this. And I'm like, that's not how I do things. I'm like, why don't we organically discover what we wanted to say by just writing? And she thinks that's crazy. And I think her approach is German. So there you go. Like too structured for me. I'm like the wishy-washy Canadian. We never written anything together, but I think her approach is crazy, and she thinks mine is crazy. So that's good. Okay. Again, capture, what you want to do. Make sure you say something interesting early on in the introduction to capture your reader's attention, right? Because people will drop out and stop reading stuff that's not interesting very quickly. What's the rationale? Again, the so what? Any kind of research project needs a so what. It needs a reason, right? So what? Who cares? Who cares about your research? So what? That's what we need to know. The research question or, your thesis, what is the argument that your paper is making? You need to have an argument, right? What is the argument that your paper is making? Why is it important? And all of that fun stuff. And then, research design and methods. We discuss that, I think, in the introduction as much. You would do that in the following sections. Okay. Yeah, you want to support your arguments, support your argument with evidence. So you want to have your discussion where you support the argument you're making in the paper with evidence. And you want to elaborate on your initial concepts. Basically, say why that argument is so and what you found out in the world that supports, your interpretation of the data. The conclusion needs to support the implications of your article, right? Theoretical and conceptual contributions in light of existing knowledge and suggest, path forward. You always want to suggest a path forward because you're always thinking about where you're going to go next, and trying to, keep people coming back to your writing. Oh, I'm losing my voice. I hate the end of this semester. This is the worst. Okay. Sorry, we're almost done. I had almost no content for today. You came for nothing, and I feel bad. I could go back and do it all again. I'm kidding, of course. No one wants that, including me. Okay. As I said, I'm very low on content at this point in the term, and this will be our end. I've been looking at other textbooks. I'm cheating on this course's textbook because I'm tired of it after teaching it for like 6 years. I'm like, I need a fresh start with this content. I just need a different take on social methods. I'm sure it would all be the same, but just kind of different. So, all right, when we're talking about writing up something like an ethnography, there's two kind of major positions that people take, either the postmodern or the realist position. Um, the postmodern one, right, will sound very familiar to a lot of people. Basically says there's no single objective reality to be studied, right? So this is our interpretivist tradition, right? Research represents only one of many subjective accounts of the particular author, right? And it's not an exhaustive representation of what has happened. So that's the postmodernist claim, and you see this a lot, right? I would say like Marxist research, participatory active research is a lot of postmodern framing. Basically say, right, nothing is definite, and this account from this author is only one possible reading of these things. That basically it needs to be followed up with others from other perspectives of that evidence. Okay, realism, right, basically says that ethnographic research, I should not turn it around, should basically does and should represent the kind of social reality as is from firsthand observations, right? That these are real social conditions that the researcher observed kind of by working with the participants. And you can think of this too, sometimes this is referred to as critical realism. Especially when one of the things that the researcher wants to do, excuse me, is to uncover the hidden kind of social mechanisms that might be, leading to particular aspects of the social world, right? But critical realist readings assume that there's one reality that has to be conveyed in a narrative, and that we do have access through our firsthand observations of a reality, and we give our, if you're doing it, give your observations, and in your discussions with participants, you can bring out other points of view, but you don't need multiple people writing the same ethnography. Oh, really sorry. My voice is completely giving out on me today. I will finish. I'm almost done. This is my favorite building ever. I don't know why. Okay. Postmodernist physician. Okay. So postmodernists, right? In writing up research, they question the notion of a pre-existing reality, right? And again, if you think back to the beginning, or this is our hard constructionist perspective, right? That there's no pre-existing reality. All knowledge is kind of relative. Everybody creates their own reality in a sense, and a particular narrative can only offer one version of that reality, but not the definitive one, because neutrality, or the God's eye view, is not possible, right? No one has, can completely step out of themselves. So no study will ever offer the definitive, complete, accurate, final portrayal of a subject matter. And readings and interpretations are the only things you have, right? Rather than observations and findings. So you don't give your observations or your findings, you give your readings or your interpretations of things. Postmodernism is how you end up with buildings like that. I can't remember where that is. I want to say that's like somewhere in the US, but I can't remember where. It's an actual building. Okay. So the postmodernist critique, has led to the idea of, oh my gosh, polymodality, right? That many voices and interpretations should be heard about a particular topic, right? That basically there's an unlimited number of perspectives on any given set of social phenomenon, and all of them should be given kind of equal weight and equal voice. And also, it tends to lead to, researchers, I guess it's challenged researchers to think about their own positions in terms of how they understand it, right? Their own biases, the power structures they're in, where their values, their kind of privileges might lead them to particular conclusions, their own, are they supporting power structures? You see this a lot in things like critical race studies, right? People, talking about their privilege comes a lot out of this postmodern critique. And basically the idea is researchers should kind of worry about the way that, the dominant social structures, cultural structures, and the political context ultimately affects the kind of research that we do and the conclusions that we draw. Okay. And I think this is pretty normalized in social science, even if someone doesn't, ascribe to a postmodern perspective. People are becoming increasingly reflective about their position. We talked about it earlier in the course, right? That one of the important things that you should do is sort of be reflective on how your positionality, how, your experiences ultimately shape your interpretation of things. Okay. I don't know why, but that picture is so much nicer. So, classical ethnographers, right, usually take a realist position on writing ethnography. So, ethnography is or should represent social reality as it is, right? Even though, yes, it's from the perspective of the researcher, but you get it from firsthand observations that we're talking to participants, right? So, you use that to craft as close to a realist or real portrait of the social environment as you can. And the task of ethnography is to, give the authoritative account, right? Because you're supposedly an expert. Can't see my pen. You're supposedly an expert, you're knowledgeable about this particular topic. So you give, an authoritative account of reality from the perspective of an expert on a topic, based on observation and contaminated as much as possible by your biases or other influences, right? So you're supposed to try and have an as unbiased a take on things as possible. So ethnography, right, is designed to convince readers that the descriptions of people and events are true, right? They're authoritative, that this represents a real view of reality. Otherwise, right, what's the point of going out and getting first-hand accounts in the field? If it's just perspectives, why do you need this first-hand account at the end of the day? Okay. Excuse me. So, are 4 characteristics of a realist tale. So, one is experiential authority. So, the author's activities are not part of the description of the subject matter, right? The descriptions you put in and analyses are presented as if they're authoritative, unbiased, and accurate, right? So you try not to put your own activities into it. You try and describe it in an unbiased way so that it's taken as unbiased, authoritative, and accurate. And you use them here, right? You use a ton of quotations from conversations and interviews to strengthen the credibility of the report. right? You might use things from your field notes, actual notes from your field notes to strengthen the credibility so that you back up what you're saying with real experiences and support it with the experiences of participants. Okay. Oh my gosh. Typical forms. I maybe taking the day off. I don't know. My voice, my sad, pitiful voice. Tomorrow I have 3 hours of nonstop lecturing. That should be fun. At the end of SOS 100, I'm gonna sound like squeaky, I think. Oh well. Almost done the semester. Okay. Typical form, right? Descriptions of the people studied are supposed to represent the characteristics that are commonly found in their group and society, right? You're supposed to take a realist portrait. You're supposed to really describe what's going on. Not necessarily look for the outliers, but pick the kind of typical one. Okay, I think I've got 3 slides left. I'm having trouble keeping an eye on the time. Participant's point of view is stressed, right? So the author, will claim to have done sufficient research to accurately portray the thoughts, feelings, and interpretations of the people studied, because seeing the world through your participants' eyes is meant to enhance that authoritative account. It's kind of the point of ethnography, right? Not just your interpretation, but the interpretation of your participants. Okay, and interpretive omnipotence. I like that one. Interpretations are provided by the author, presented as virtually incontrovertible. Yeah, I don't know if that's true, but usually people, claim that they are very authoritative, right? That this is what I saw. This is, the correct interpretation based on my observations. And generally, alternative suggestions or alternative interpretations aren't given, serious consideration. I think that's probably a strong form. I think sometimes people say, like, this is what I saw. These other interpretations are possible, but I think less likely given this, and this, right? You tend to want to come down strongly on your interpretation. Okay, so So, 3 forms of ethnographic writing. Our first one is the one I was just talking about, our realist tale. Definitive, confident, dispassionate, third-person account of a culture and behavior. And this is the most common in ethnographic writing. Our second one, next in line for confessional tales. Personalized accounts about the experience of the ethnographer. These are a little bit more rare. You sometimes find these more in journalistic accounts, right? Where people go and experience something like they join the Hells Angels, and talk about their year with the Hells Angels or something like that. But these are more personal, right? Bring in more of the person's actual experiences. Let's say, sometimes you'll see this in group accounts, right? Where you're studying a group that you're already part of and doing that as an ethnography, right? Your experiences go in there as well. Yeah, in a sense, they're more reflexive because you're kind of revealing your personal biases and your personal experiences as well. You admit, less like the realist tale, you admit, your methodological and I would say ethical or even ideological sins, right? You admit that maybe you have an agenda in doing the research, and typically more concerned with presenting how the research was carried out than with the findings, right? It's more like, this is the story of the research I did. This is why it was great, and all of this stuff. I'm trying to think of an example. I think it's like, I can't remember his name now. Oh, it's the Code of the Street. It's the book. I feel like it's a confessional tale, but I can't remember his name. For some reason, Eli something. Okay, and then the Impressionist tale, and I'll end. I think this is my last slide today. Okay, the Impressionist tale, right? So, not for nothing, I have Starry Night, the famous Impressionist painting. Experiences of the ethnographer and the description of what is, right, are combined with stories about dramatic events which help the researcher uncover and understand, right? So it's more like kind of a mix of the two, the realist account and the professional account, right? You kind of mix the two together to give people a really strong impression of what happened, right? Exposes fieldwork experiences that led to acceptance and knowledge. Basically it exposes like what in the fieldwork led you to certain conclusions. Allows you to talk about the moments of the research that really caused you to come to certain conclusions at the end of the day, and mixes that realist, um, the realist and the confessional really well. So yeah, the researcher becomes part of the story of the research, and both the culture and the researcher are in the story, and you tell, what happened in your observations, how you played a role in it, how it affected you, how particular moments of it led you to certain conclusions and understandings and all of these sorts of things. Okay, and those are our three forms of ethnographic writing, and I am done like dinner. Sorry, I'm done early. Boo. Boo. You're the worst. You've denied us 2 more lectures in Intro to Social Methods by burning through all your material. We are all so sad. All right. What's that? Yeah, I think that's it. He's at Yale. Forget his name. Oh, he's black. Okay. Oh,